Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from at this time of the day. Thank you so much for making the time to join our webinar. Please note that we have interpretation in French, Spanish, and Portuguese that's available. So if you'd like interpretation, there's a little globe somewhere at the bottom of your screen. You can choose the interpretation that you would like. So this session is part of the Global Days of Action on Tax Justice for Women's Rights, which is led by the Global Alliance for Tax Justice through the Tax and Gender Working Group, which we are a part of. And this Global Days basically brings together feminists, women's rights organizations, and civil society groups and allies from across the world to really just advance clear demands for progressive taxation as a foundation for the realization of women's rights and achieving gender equality. So this is an annual campaign that started all the way in 2017. So it's been a long time since we've been trying to advocate for tax justice for women's rights. So my name is Jennfier. I'm joining you from Malawi, and I'll be one of the moderators for today's session. And just to mention that this webinar has been organized by ActionAid as part of the Tax and Education Alliance, where I serve as the Tax and Gender Equality Policy Advisor. And the TaxAid Alliance is a partnership that brings together global tax justice and education actors to push for transformative breakthroughs in the domestic financing of public education. And so for our session today, we will be talking about the role of the IMF in influencing tax policy at the national level and what that means for gender equality, because we know that we cannot talk about reforming the global financial architecture or the international tax system without talking about the IMF. So we'll be talking about all of that and how IMF influences national tax policies and how that affects public spending priorities, care systems, and ultimately what that means for gender equality outcomes. And at the same time, we also recognize that we're operating within a shifting political economy and one that's forcing us to really think about different strategies. So it's asking us to reshape the strategies that are available to us for influencing, but also for resistance. So we want to take some time in this session to think about what alternative resistance and solidarity, but also feminist organizing really looks like in our times today. And we hope that during this session, we can hear from all of you so that we think together, brainstorm together, and just share different ways of influencing given the current context that we're operating in. So before we get into our discussion, we want to first hear from you. I'm going to ask you to please add an emoji in the chat that expresses how you feel when you hear about the IMF. So what emotions or reactions come up for you when you hear about the IMF? You can add any emoji, whether it's an expression of happiness, whether it's sadness, anger, just any emoji that expresses how you really, really feel when you hear about the IMF. I'm seeing rolling eyes. There's some angry emojis that are coming in. So just take a few more seconds just to pop those in the chat. Yeah, if you feel called to explain, do feel free to type that in the chat. If you feel that an emoji is not enough to express your emotions and feelings about this, you're free to just add more text if that's what you would like to do. All right, we can keep those coming in as we continue. And yeah, just to say, so far with the reactions, I absolutely resonate with each of those. There's a lot of anger that comes from me. And at the same time, there's also hope, knowing that we're all here together, knowing that there's a growing movement that is pushing against this system. So that gives me some hope that things will change, that we're all collectively working on different alternatives and we're all, pushing for a better world. So that gives me some hope, but majority of it is a lot of anger towards the system. So thank you all for interacting with that. You can continue popping in the emojis as the conversation goes. And as I said, if you also want to add some text, feel free to do that. I am now going to invite Phindu, who is going to ground this conversation with a poem called Care is a Doing Word. Now, Phindu is a Malawian feminist storyteller who primarily expresses herself through spoken word poetry. She draws from lived experience to explore themes of social justice, gender, grief, well-being, and human searching. Her work centers the voices of women and girls seeking to spotlight the work of navigating resistance and healing in the patriarchal societies. She is the founding member of Mazgu Feminist Collective and a passionate advocate for women's autonomy and liberation. What a powerhouse. So thank you so much, Phindu, for accepting to come in and ground this conversation with the poem. I will now hand over to you to take over the next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennfier. I am happy to be here and happy to share this piece with you and hope that it resonates with everyone listening. Care is a doing word. What they desperately want you to believe is that care is a whisper, a background task, an afterthought, the crumbs left over that nobody wants. They would have you believe that care is a painstaking chore, a cruel responsibility you have to bear because of your gender, a thing you must do for others despite your bleeding hands, despite the fact that your brittle bones are cracked and there is an incessant throbbing in your bent back. They will callously label you as selfish for pouring into yourself, for pausing to rest your feet as you walk across the charcoal pit, for loosening their grip on your throat in an attempt to swallow, for closing your eyes longer than the millisecond it takes to blink, for having the audacity to put I before you like the alphabet intended. They don't want you to be rested or restored, so do not buy into the rhetoric, the phony iterations of relaxation that are really divisive tools of capitalism. Just another way for the patriarchy to stick a middle finger at the very women whose selfless giving has made it possible for the world to keep spinning. Unfortunately for them, though, we have learned the language of liberation. We know now that care is not a whisper, nor is it a growling stomach. We have taught each other that syntax and grammar are social constructs. In the same way, it makes no sense for us to stand rigid when we are literally water. So to the systems that attempt to beat us down and weaponize our softness, we shout from the rooftops that care is a verb, care is a doing word. Care is loud and political, a survival choreography performed daily by women who refuse to disappear in the thick of what we endure. Care is a radical act in a world that profits from exhaustion. It is not indulgence or privilege to rest and heal, to step back and breathe, to look within and feel. It is military strategy and tactical movement in a battle we did not choose. It is revolution at the cellular level as the war against women rages on. Because how can we build the future with trembling and weary hands? How can we fight for justice on 1 hour of sleep and empty plates? Please point me in the direction of victory achieved without sustenance. We talk about collective care like it is theory, when in reality, it is the most pure example of muscle memory. We have always known how to hold one another when systems do not. We are the infrastructure, the comprehensive safety nets woven from soft hands and sharp tongues regardless of our dialects. Collective care is the aunties packing snacks and an extra blanket, the friends sending bail money and bringing over a bottle of cheap wine, the lovers saying, "Drink some water," and the quiet text that says, "I am still here." Care is the backbone of every march and the drumbeat beneath every chant. I hope you remember. The foundation of care for the collective is care for the self. Everyday habits and rituals that replenish your energy are crucial in a system that exploits your desire to be seen and loved. To love oneself in a culture built on our depletion is to light a candle in a blackout and gather firewood for the winter. To love oneself today is to care about being here tomorrow. So rest, my sister, and let that be your mark of resistance. Because we need you whole, not hollow, and care is our power in the same way our softness is our sharpest tool. So remind yourself when your shoulders slump, when you're tempted to accept defeat, that care is not an afterthought or a silly treat. Care is how we begin, how we continue, and ultimately, care is how we win. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Phindu. Sending you flowers after such a beautiful piece. It always is a pleasure to hear you, to hear your spoken word that you always do so beautifully. And also, thank you so much for speaking on this issue of care being a doing word, which really aligns with this year's Global Days of Action theme, which is tax justice for the human right to care, but also emphasizing that care is revolution at a cellular level, and that self and collective care is resistance. So thank you so much for that beautiful piece. I am now going to invite my colleague Roos, who's going to briefly talk about an ActionAid study that examines the role of the IMF in shaping tax policy and public spending. And Roos is a feminist and economic justice activist who is passionate about creating inclusive spaces to discuss power, women's rights, and economics. She's currently the global lead on economic justice and public services at ActionAid International. So thank you, Roos, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennfier and Phindu, for that poem. As when I heard your words before, as the chills going down my spine. So very hard to follow this, but I think it's good to be centered in what the words that you've used, that this is a battle that we did not choose, but care is how we win. So why are we talking about the IMF in relation to care and unpaid care work and gender equality? The IMF has disproportionate influence on government's economic policies, especially in the global south, through its loan programs and its yearly surveillance advice to governments. And despite its recent rhetoric on gender, up until the second Trump administration at least, the IMF's advice has remained very similar since the 80s. During the discredited area of the structural adjustment programs. So incredibly outdated. Austerity policies is still the default, and continuing to undermine public services and its workforce, in which women tend to work more in the public sector, as well as needing public services in order to achieve gender equality and for redistributing unpaid care work. And we found again and again that the IMF is failing to systematically do gender impact assessments of its policy advice, and that it rarely uses alternatives such as progressive taxation, failing to offer a transformative path. So the IMF is keeping us stuck in the past. So ActionAid has continued to scrutinize the IMF's advice at national level, and I'm sharing some insights from a soon-to-be published report, where we looked at a deliberately wide spectrum of 11 countries, analyzing the latest loan documents, so from loan programs, but also Article 4, or the surveillance advice, which is yearly, and technical assistance advice over a 3-year period since February 2022 to 2025. And countries included in this are Brazil, Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, Nepal, Nigeria, Senegal, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and the UK. And we have 3 amazing colleagues who will share with us on their work from 3 of these countries in a minute. We want to shed light on the actual advice given by the IMF to these governments, not its PR messages or the pinkwashing of its actual advice that are coming from headquarters. This does not mean that the policies are all implemented, as there is social resistance and challenges at national level. So this is hopeful. And we hope that this session reiterates and challenges the IMF's disproportionate influence on national level economic policies, and specifically how austerity policies, including regressive tax policies, are undermining access to public services and undermining gender equality. So this conversation is really in the context of a growing debt crisis where 75% of lower income countries are spending more on servicing their debts than they do on health, and 50% of countries are spending more on debt than they do on education. And it is evident from the IMF's advice that indebted countries need to prioritize repaying their debt at full, as we'll hear from colleagues from Zambia and Ghana in a minute, and also the severe costs and cuts to the budget, as we showed in a survey last year on the human costs of public sector cuts in Africa, where we surveyed people in the community and health and education workers. So from this unpublished research, we found across all 11 countries that the IMF is expanding its tax or domestic resource mobilization advice. So this is really an actor to keep our eye on for progressive tax policy or for undermining progressive tax policy. And in some of the IMF documents, the IMF talks about value-added taxes, excise taxes, and carbon taxes, and sometimes tariffs, though not consistently, and mainly the elimination and streamlining of VAT exemptions, so consumption taxes, is often aimed at broadening the tax base and improving collection. And we know that value-added taxes tend to be regressive and therefore also impact women more. And that removing exemption often means adding additional taxes to basic goods, on which lower household incomes depend and spend a larger share of their income on. And we found in 3 countries, in Kenya, Senegal, and Uganda, that the IMF specifically advised to remove exemptions and raising new VAT, so new taxes, on education services and healthcare. So this is, of course, very problematic. In addition, raising excise taxes on things like fuel, alcohol, and tobacco is routinely advised, and this tends to also be regressive. The IMF continues to fail in systematically assessing the regressivity or progressivity of the existing tax system at national level, because one tax might be regressive, but if the overall system is progressive, this can be a good thing, but it doesn't assess that at all. Nor does it do any distributional impact on its policy advice offered on tax or on the overall impact of its reforms on different segments of the population, so other marginalized groups relevant to that national context. We found on gender analysis is largely missing throughout the document, and where it is present, it is tokenistic or instrumentalist. And more importantly, the IMF fails to assess the gendered impact of its own fiscal and policy recommendations on social spending, public sector workers, and on tax. And this is nothing new, but its PR wants to make people believe that it does do this. We also found across the documents a heightened sense of the IMF needing to sell their advice and reform packages and create public buy-in. And this is interesting because there are discussions around social backlash and the need to outreach and do a communication campaign. These were mentioned in advice to Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, and Uganda. So in summary, the gaps between the IMF rhetoric and practice are growing. It's still advising the same policies as years ago, but more advice on tax. It lacks any systematic analysis across its policy advice. So we find that today the IMF is our great-grandparents' IMF, born on colonial grounds and still serving the interest of global North countries, creditors, and multinational companies, and deeply unaccountable to the people whose lives and bodies it shapes and controls. So despite the lack of change in some of the IMF advice, even the IMF acknowledges that the success of its proposed reforms ultimately depends on political commitments and government's willingness. So in several global South contexts, the governments have had strong political commitments and priorities, for example, on financing free education, public education. They have been able to resist IMF prescribed policies, demonstrating that such reforms are not fixed when national priorities take precedence and there's organization at national level. So that gives us some hope. And as such, we really want to focus the rest of the conversation on national governments, actions that national governments can take, and the resistance of social movements to allow for these systemic shifts at national level, but also on how global economic decisions are made. So the UN Tax Convention negotiations is the best space for states to continue negotiating global tax rules away from the IMF and the OECD. And as mentioned, the IMF is giving more advice on tax, so this would be a very important shift. So now we will hear from our colleagues from Ghana, Brazil, and Zambia, and I will introduce everyone before they speak, and then we will have an open discussion. So firstly, I'm very excited to introduce Eugenia Ayagiba, who is a feminist advocate and women's rights and advocacy manager at ActionAid Ghana, where she has led on national campaigns and supported movement building efforts in the last 3 years. Her work focuses on advancing gender equality, strengthening feminist movements, and promoting economic justice through gender-responsive public services and financing. She holds a Master in Development Management from GIMPA and a bachelor's degree from the University of Ghana, Legon, where her research examined gender-based violence in Ghana. And outside of work, she enjoys singing, swimming, and learning new hobbies. So Eugenia, over to you to share with us about the role of the IMF on tax policy and gender equality in Ghana.
Thank you very much, Roos, and good afternoon to everybody. I know we are talking about IMF, but since our research that we did looked at the gender impacts, we wanted to look at the lived realities of people, of our constituents. So I would want to begin with a market woman. We have a very big market in Ghana where every morning by 5 o'clock a.m., every woman from all walks of life goes to that market to go and then earn some income. So can you kindly just picture a woman with a big basket of maybe plantains, fish, cassava, whatever you can think of, going to that market. She has already cooked for her children. She's preparing the goods for sale. She carries prices in her head like an accountant. I don't know whether you've met those women. The way they can calculate, you wonder where they learned it from. Recently, the prices of tomatoes have gone up. Cooking oil has increased. Transport fares has shifted. Then government says, I'm increasing VAT, or indirect taxes expands. That means either market toll levies, whatever have you is done. And then for her, it's not about what is read, it's about her lived reality. It's about the margin of profit for her that she's going to lose. So what happens to her? Is she going to pass everything on to customers? If she passes it on and she increases the prices, somebody like me will go to the market and I wouldn't buy. So she would definitely say, okay, let me divide it into 2. So you have her taking part of it. Then what does that mean? That means she's reducing what she keeps for herself and her children. And then again, she's going to work long hours just to make up for the margin of revenue she's lost. To everybody, this tax reform that has come up is revenue mobilization. Hey, we need more money. The country is losing money. We need to pay our debts. We need to do this. Where do we get the money? We need to mobilize revenue. And how do we do that? It's through tax. But for her, that is an unpaid adjustment. Please keep that in mind. And her lived reality, that means her income is going to reduce. Then the same woman has a child in school. And our research that we did shows that enrollment has increased significantly in recent years. That is about 30% in the last 3 to 5 years. And our research again shows us that 48% of teachers in Ghana have reported heavier workloads with pay reduced. And as for school supplies, we don't talk about it. Most of the people we interviewed said sometimes they have to even pay for tables and chairs. And I just took my child to school recently. I had to buy a table for the child because there was not enough tables in the school for her to use. And if I wanted her to have a comfortable life in school, I needed to buy that table and chair for her. So I had to buy it for her. Then at the health sector, what does our research again show? It shows that medicine costs are rising. My mom is on some, cholesterol drugs, and every month she complains that allowance we give to her, she uses about 90% of that just to buy drugs. The nurses are complaining about inadequate pay. And then you realize that everybody is stressed because facilities are not even well, the facilities are not well resourced to even do the things that they want to do. But then at the end of the day, everybody talks about it's going to be revenue mobilization at the end of the day. What is the human cost? At the end of the day, do they think, or policymakers think about how it costs the human being to do this? And is this where tax policy connects with gender equality? Does it really look at that? And in a country like Ghana, you realize that tax or indirect tax, especially VAT, remains a very central tool in terms of revenue mobilization. And our research has adequately showed that women are disproportionately at disadvantage when it comes to this because they are mostly represented at the lower income household levels. So when tax systems rely heavily on consumption taxes, the burden does not distribute evenly. So one of the things I asked, from lived reality to policy reality, you realize that Ghana has had a very long relationship with the IMF, and we've had a lot of multiple extended credit facility programs with them. So our research looked at the 16th and the 17th extended credit facility that we had. And then when we looked at it in terms of the gendered impact, we realized that IMF now recognizes gender equality as macro-critical. This is very significant, meaning that they recognize that inequality can actually undermine growth and stability. But wait, we realize that there was a gap between recognition and implementation, as Roos rightly put it. While gender is acknowledged at the strategic level, tax reforms continue to prioritize macroeconomic targets and revenue tools, particularly indirect taxation. Gender disaggregated analysis was limited. You realize that gender indicators were not systematically embedded into the program for monitoring frameworks. I remember at an IMF meeting, I asked, have we considered, they kept on talking about how the facility has helped Ghana, and then I was like, have we considered how the gender aspect of it? And they said, oh, we have a document in every program. What we do, we make sure there are women represented and all that. Now, like, but your policies do not indicate that. Have you really had an analysis of the impact of the advice you give to government and how it's not going to, it's affecting, the women in Ghana? So one of the things we also saw was that they say gender mainstreaming is formally part of IMF strategy. IMF programs in Ghana focus on fiscal consolidation, revenue mobilized, but it really does not work there. It's still at the macroeconomic level. It doesn't really come down to us. So the gap is not about intention, it's about the design, how these advices are designed, how the facilities are designed, and even how the tax system is also in the design and how it interacts with existing inequalities as we've seen it. Because we have most of our women actually being low-paid women, pay gaps really exist in all that. And then you realize that in Ghana too, women don't really own assets. Mostly because we are in a very patriarchal society, women are not allowed, or even it's only a few women who are able to own assets. Again, I said there is income disparities, and then unpaid care responsibilities in the country sort of put a lot of pressure on them. So when tax reforms are introduced without robust gender impact assessment, they risk reinforcing these inequalities. So for us in Ghana, this is something that we looked at, and then we had what do you call it? We had the research, and then we came out with our findings. So we are actually right now looking at how do we really work on this with the policymakers to work on it. And then again, when you look at our human cost public cuts, you realize that budget cuts mean larger class sizes, fewer supplies, and parents filling funding gaps. As I said, I am also filling the gap. Rising health costs and stagnant wages create burnout among frontline workers. I think the last one, we have a lot of health workers sitting at home, but then we have a lot of, the health sector lacks a lot of manpower to do their work. I think the last time I had a presentation, I actually was able to show, that was when in January last year, when nurses were saying they were going on strike because they were not being paid well and their conditions of service was also not very good for them. So these are the things that we see, and they weaken the care services, weaken, how do I put, when the services weaken, care does not disappear, it shifts. It shifts into households. It shifts onto women's unpaid care time because the woman has more to do. So indirect taxation, as we see it, goes to fiscal consolidation, service strain, unpaid care expansion, and deepen gender inequality. This is the lived experiences that we have in Ghana right now. I would want to say that somebody would say that, oh, we've heard the new government has done a lot of reforms in terms of removing, VAT, repealed e-levy, raised some VAT thresholds, and modernized income and digital taxation. These are meaningful reforms. They create opportunity. If the tax mix moves toward more progressive sources and reduces excessive reliance on consumption tax, pressure on lower income households can ease. I'm saying this because in Ghana, we have a lot of tax havens where big corporations are not taxed, because in the name of we need to get more investment into the country, they are not taxed. Properties, come to Ghana and you will see the properties going up. But then how many of them are really being taxed? These people are not taxed, but every day we have more taxes in terms of VAT and then all that. Then we have, apart from the VAT and the systematized tax regime that is in the country, you have to know that these women pay market tolls at the market for toilet, for urinal, for even collection of rubbish. They pay taxes. And all this increases their burdens at the end of the day. So one of the questions I keep on asking myself is what must really change in the country, because it looks like women, the more we are mobilizing, it's more like when more revenue is generated, you have to know that one woman is suffering. A woman is suffering somewhere. Her child going to school is suffering. So what must really change for us to see a change in this disproportionate distribution of taxes and the burden on women at the end of the day? One of the things we came up with after our research was that we need to conduct a gender impact assessment before tax reforms. Yes, our governments that just came in, we are all happy with the economic strides they are making. Oh, our CD is going on well. They've cut some taxes, they've removed taxes. But then, did the government really conduct an impact assessment to know that this tax that I'm removing, it's actually going to affect this person or not? No. It was just a face-off thing that said, let's reduce taxes, let's do that. They don't, if you ask a government official today, what is the gendered impact? What is the impact of these tax reforms? The first thing they will tell you is we are getting more revenue. And that is...
Eugenia, do you mind wrapping up so we can go to the next speaker?
We also think what we are pushing for is for the IMF in itself to actually embed some gender indicators in its framework, which is lost. It should strengthen the data disaggregated systems. We need data disaggregation when it comes to their work, and then promote gender tax, design in the work they do. And I think in closing, I would want to say that Ghana's evidence shows that tax structure and public cuts have gendered consequences. Can we design a tax system that stabilizes economies without destabilizing equality? And then tax policy redistributes time, power, and burden. So we need to ensure that these things are stabilized. Otherwise, we risk stabilizing budgets while destabilizing justice, especially for women in our society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eugenia, for starting with the market women and really taking us through the different impacts and asking some very poignant questions there. I will not take more space, so I will pass it on to our next speaker, Maryellen Crisostomo, who is Economic Justice Specialist at ActionAid Brazil. She is Quilombola from the Bajau territory, and apologies for the pronunciation there. Maryellen holds a bachelor degree in social communication and journalism, and she's pursuing another bachelor's degree in law at the State University in Tocantins. She's also working as an executive coordinator in the state coordination of Quilombola communities in Tocantins, and she's a member of the Women's Collective of the National Coordination for the Articulation of Quilombos, and a member of the Brazilian Collective for Social Communications, Intervoces, and a member of the Board of Directors of Greenpeace Brazil and Director of Mobilization and Training at the Journalist Union of Tocantins. So very long list of busy activities, Maryellen. So thank you so much for joining us, and really looking forward to hearing from you on the situation in Brazil. Over to you.
Bom dia. Aqui
Good
no
morning.
Brasil, boa tarde,
Here in Brazil,
saudações.
good afternoon,
Bem,
wherever you
a
are.
política monetária no
Greetings.
Brasil, consegue me ouvir?
Well,
Okay.
yes, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Ok. A política... ok, thank you, obrigada. Bem, a política monetária no Brasil e as recomendações do Fundo Monetário Internacional, eles moldam diretamente as políticas
the
fiscais
IMF
e tributárias
recommendations in Brazil,
em todos os seus
they
países membros,
go,
incluindo o Brasil,
they
com efeitos
directly
tangíveis na
affect
provisão de
the
políticas públicas sociais que
stability and control
atendem
of public debt in
prioritariamente a
Brazil,
população negra, mulheres e
and
meninas.
they
Em sua
often
essência, o
reach
FMI
first,
incentiva
and
países a
negatively,
manterem estabilidade
they affect
macroeconômica e
the
controle da dívida
populations,
pública,
the black and
frequentemente
female
traduzidos em metas
populations
de
in the country.
superávit fiscal, restrições em
They
gastos
usually
públicos
use this
e
kind of
reformas
language of
tributárias
fiscal surplus
consideradas
targets,
disciplinadoras pelas
restrictions on
autoridades
public
financeiras
spending, and tax
internacionais,
reforms
e
considered
mesmo pelos
disciplinary
estados e
by,
governos.
by
Essa orientação,
financial
embora
authorities.
formalmente neutra, tem
This
impactos
guidance,
reais
while
sobre
formally
as
neutral,
prioridades de
has real
gasto
impacts
social
on
e a
social spending
capacidade do
priorities
Estado de
and
financiar
the state's
sistemas de
capacity to
cuidado
finance
inclusivos.
inclusive care
O Ministério da
systems.
Fazenda do Brasil, por
The
exemplo, traz
Ministry
uma
of
análise do
Finance
olhar do FMI
presents
para a
an
economia
analysis
brasileira,
of
que aponta
IMF's
crescimento
perspective on
surpreendente
Brazilian
e
economy, which
projeta,
points to
traz também
surprising growth
projeção
and
da
projected
inflação para o ano de
inflation for
2025.
2025.
O modelo de financiarização no Brasil, ele se consolidou a
Historically,
partir dos anos
fiscal
1990
adjustment
e
programs
1980,
associated with recommendations
quando,
from
seguindo a
international
tendência
organizations,
latino-americana, o foco
especially
deslocou-se
policies
da
aimed at
crise da
reducing
dívida externa
deficits
para o
and
crescimento da dívida
debt,
pública interna.
tend to result
Embora
in freezes
majoritariamente
or cuts in
doméstica,
social
tornou-se
spending,
mecanismo
as already
central de
observed in Brazil
aprofundamento da lógica
in the
financeira.
post-2016
Nesse
period,
modelo,
when
marcado por
austerity measures
características
widened
usuárias devido
racial
às
and
elevadas
gender
taxas de juros,
inequalities
bancos
impacting
e
Black women and
investidores
other marginalized
institucionais
groups,
ampliam sua
more severely
apropriação de
according to
rendas
the
tanto
report
sobre a dívida
Human Rights in
pública
Time of
quanto
Austerity.
sobre o endividamento privado de famílias e
In
empresas,
this regard,
enquanto
it is
instrumentos
important to
como o Fundo
notice that
Social de Emergência, as metas de superávit
funds
primário vinculadas
and
ao FMI. No Brasil, a
and
lei da
targets set
responsabilidade
by
fiscal e a
IMF
proposta de emenda à
are
Constituição número
really
55, chamada de teto de
done in
gastos,
disregard of
prioriza o
the
pagamento
most
de
vulnerable
juros e
populations in
investimento em
Brazil.
políticas sociais e empurram trabalhadores e
The measures
trabalhadoras
restricted
para
the
o setor
state's
privado
capacity
de
to invest in
serviços
health
e
education and
fortalecem a
social protection at a level that responds to the existing structural inequality in the country. The pillars of Brazilian society are anchored in patriarchalism, patrimonialism, and racism, factors that keep social fissures open that are only mitigated through public policies of social inclusion. In our case in particular, these austerity measures tend to cut the budget on health and education. And these measures widen the gap between marginalized groups and the wealthy. And this is something that INESC, for example, the Institute of Socioeconomic Studies, have said in the past. So these measures restricted the state's capacity to invest in health, education, and social protection. The pillars of Brazilian society are anchored in patriarchalism, patrimonialism, and racism, factors that keep social fissures open that are only mitigated through public policies of social inclusion. In the contemporary Brazilian case, the IMF's influence manifests itself both in projections and warnings, as well as in technical exercises such as the Article 5 consultations publicized by the Ministry of Finance in July 2025, in which fund specialists assess the national economy and suggest priorities such as improving tax efficiency, expanding the revenue base, and strengthening fiscal rules. Although the report may report progress and economic growth, it also emphasizes the need for restrictive monetary policies and continued fiscal discipline as a condition for the sustainability of public debt. This emphasis on fiscal discipline has direct implications for public policies that serve the Black majority, women and girls, financing healthcare and health services. By prioritizing fiscal adjustments to reduce deficits and stabilize debt, pressure is mounting for strict limits on public spending. This can restrict spending in the public health system, such as SUS, the Brazilian healthcare system, which was established 35 years ago and where women make up 75% of the public health workforce, according to the data from the National Registry of Health Establishments. There's also a reduction in essential care services, areas where demand is high among women who historically perform unpaid care work and depend on quality public services. When fiscal discipline requirements impose limits, funding for these services may be sufficient to equitably meet the needs of the most vulnerable population. Tax policies and progressivity. The IMF's recommendations tend to emphasize efficiency and broadening the tax base with fewer distortions. In practice, if this is not accompanied by explicit mechanisms of progressivity and social protection, it can lead to a greater burden on consumption or on sectors less able to pay, which amplifies existing inequalities between historically marginalized social groups, such as traditional peoples and communities, both urban and rural, especially when Black women and families face lower incomes and greater family responsibilities. According to the Ministry of Racial Equality, Black Brazilian women represent 28% of the general population. They are a minority in demographic statistics, but they lead the statistics on inequalities and violations of rights. The majority of those assisted by income transfer policies, the majority in unemployment, in informal work, the majority also without their own housing, and the majority as victims of femicide and domestic violence. According to the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, 37% of families headed by Black women suffer from moderate or severe food security. However, without realistic distributive mechanisms that are consistent with local society, tax reforms inspired by international guidelines will never compensate for deep inequalities. Now, as to reducing income transfer policies, transfer programs aimed at reducing poverty and vulnerability, which historically benefit women in single-parent households and Black women, are targeted for cuts or limitations as part of fiscal adjustments due to accumulated income inequalities. This diminishes the state's capacity to fulfill basic human rights related to care, food, education, and social protection when these policies are restricted to meet adjustment targets. Finally, monetary policy and fiscal adjustment recommendations associated with the IMF tend to reinforce austerity paradigms that limit the Brazilian state's capacity to fully invest in structural social public policies. These effects translate into less funding for healthcare, community services, education system, and social protection mechanisms, which are essential for promoting racial and gender equality. To mitigate these impacts, strategies are needed that integrate fiscal requirements with objectives of tax justice and gender equity, ensuring that sustainable economic policies do not sacrifice fundamental social rights. This is because social inclusion public policies in Brazil are the main instrument for repairing and compensating for the structural inequalities that make up the pillars of Brazilian society, which in turn are anchored in patrimonialism, patriarchalism, capitalism, and racism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maryellen, for really setting out so clearly the different relations of IMF policy on rights and ability to spend, but also really on addressing these structural inequalities intersectionally, especially the statistics you mentioned of Black women and how marginalized they are. So I think it's really clear that this the IMF is really doing the opposite of what is needed. And thank you for your suggestions there. We are now going to go to our third speaker, and then we'll have an open discussion. So next we will have Chika Chilekwa, who is the program coordinator at ActionAid Zambia, where she serves as the women's rights focal point and thematic lead for transformative youth-led engagements. Her work focuses on advancing feminist economic justice, climate justice, and inclusive democratic participation by supporting women, young people, and grassroots movements to challenge inequality and demand accountable governance by the state. She is passionate about amplifying community voices and strengthening collective feminist action, such as this one, that centers care, justice, and political decision-making. Chika, a pleasure to have you, and over to you to share with us on Zambia.
Thank you so much, Roos. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone, depending with where you are joining from. In discussing the IMF, and I like what Roos said and what we've heard from what the previous speakers have acknowledged and we've recognized to say the IMF are actually doing the opposite of what they are supposed to be doing in enhancing gender equality. So we all know that the IMF has a gender mainstreaming strategy, which they introduced in 2022. And then on paper, this is a good thing because the IMF are recognizing on their own to say macroeconomic policy is not gender neutral. And from some of the examples from our previous speakers, we have been able to see that debt management and taxation will fundamentally affect women's lived realities differently from the way it will affect men's lived realities. And as ActionAid, we have criticized the IMF in the care contradiction research paper that was actually led by Roos. Roos, kudos to you for giving us this very insightful piece of information that we are using for our advocacy on tax justice. So in the Care for Contradiction paper, one of the things that we have criticized the IMF on is how they have failed to address core policy on austerity, public spending cuts, which are systematically harming women, instead of preventing negative gendered impact, and also instead of focusing on increasing women's unpaid care burden and reducing decent work opportunities. And we can have an example from Zambia. In Zambia, what we've had in Zambia, what the IMF has emphasized is on domestic revenue mobilization. And this is because historically Zambia has been in a very bad place debt-wise. Zambia was heavily dated. Our economic situation was really bad. Inflation was high. The cost of living was high. We actually failed to pay our debt somewhere around 2020. We also had issues with climate justice and climate change, and these were impacting livelihoods for our people, our constituents, and our rights holders, and us on the daily. So yes, Zambia has come out of that situation, right? And through some of the recommendations that the IMF provided, like the removal of subsidies, we have scaled down our fees programs, we have increased electricity tariffs, because as part of the drought that we experienced, we had very little electricity. It was as bad as having electricity for 2 hours in a day. We also had increased taxation, that is the VAT in the informal sector, excise duties. And we also had some tax reforms on pay, even though these had minimal effect, because on low-income households, the band was so low that it was not trickling down to the rights holders in the communities who are middle and low-income bearing households. And ultimately, these were affecting women disproportionately as they're affecting men. We have had what seems to be progressive, but not entirely progressive, because they're still impacting women. We have had what seems to be some progressive tax reforms, like we had the introduction of tax on betting, on alcohol, on tobacco. These somewhat are, progressive, but not entirely progressive, because then when you look at it, majority of the women are the ones who are providing for families. We've got a lot of female-headed households in Zambia. And then if, for instance, we've got a tax levy on when you bet, right? And when you get that money from betting, you are going to be taxed, meaning the money that you get is ultimately less. And then this is going to put pressure on the household. So the woman at home is going to think of, what extra things can I do to ensure that our family is provided for? So they have somewhat seemed to be progressive, but they haven't necessarily been progressive. And then also when you look at our budgeting process at Zambia, we have a gender status report that's produced annually. And for each of our budget heads, we have gender responsive output indicators. And in 2024, we had 12 gender responsive output indicators out of 60 budget heads, which is not a very good number. And this was the case in 2023. In 2022, it was low. I think it was 14, if I'm not mistaken. So which is not a very good number. So from a gender perspective, right, the IMF is largely referencing women through social protection, through empowerment initiatives, right? But there's still limited analysis of how is it that tax reforms can affect women differently from men. And for instance, there are no systematic assessments, just as my previous speakers have highlighted, on the impact of turnover taxes for women-owned businesses. For instance, we saw Eugenia giving us a very vivid image of of that, right? Or some of the implications of fiscal adjustments on unpaid care work, and also just on the household welfare in general. I am now going to open it up for comments and reflections. You can either raise your hand or you can comment in the chat box if you've got any reflections or if you've got any questions, or you can unmute your mic.
Hi, friends. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
I cannot. Okay. I cannot.
Yes, greetings.
Hi.
I don't know if
Hi.
you
I
can
cannot
hear me
find.
well.
Yes. I
Sorry,
just
we have two
did.
people trying to come in at the same time. So can we first go to Christine and then come to Isabella after? We can hear you both, but
Okay. I am Christine Kaya. Are you
welcome,
hearing me?
Christine. Yes, welcome. Go ahead.
Yes, I am a member of parliament from Uganda, and I'm an environmentalist. And thank you very much for the submissions. I've been listening in. And I think what we are missing somehow is to assess the women's vulnerability at every supply chain, at every production chain, in the different sectors. So sometimes you find that when women are thinking of what to do, they are looking at where exactly are women vulnerable. And to me, we have been looking at the budget framework papers, and we get solid figures of how far countries have incorporated gender, but getting the real vulnerability, which even changes every year, is a serious challenge. And then committing some funds to address some of these vulnerabilities is becoming a challenge. It's as if addressing gender inequality is a luxury, is an addition in addition to something else very important. So countries have failed to commit, and that one does not come in the non-tax revenues. You find it is not coming out. In the trickling back part of the budget to address the vulnerabilities is not coming out well. And to me, I feel further research should be helping us on that, such that when we are planning for our budgets, we put updated vulnerabilities, we put budget items addressing updated women vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, for the reflections. It's very important, and it's what everybody on this webinar has been saying. We need assessments of women's vulnerabilities. I can see a hand from Eugenia. Eugenia, you can go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I just wanted to agree with the last speaker in terms of the vulnerability. But then if I'm going to use Ghana as an example again, we have a Ministry for Gender Social Protection as we speak, and they have a budget. But then when we go onto this ECF, it's more or less like it is the social protection issues that are cut as services. So for instance, and then our government's commitment to ensuring that women are also protected, as you said, is very minimal. It's like it's always gender and something else. So for instance, ActionAid Ghana did a research looking at the, what do you call it? The amount of money that is given to domestic violence. We have a domestic violence fund. How much of the ministry's budget goes in there? You realize that we only have 0.13% of that budget in going into gender-based violence. The rest goes into government, other activities that really don't do anything to women. So again, for me, it boils, what you are saying is right, but it also boils down to the commitment of our governments. It also boils down to our governments realizing that gender is important. That's thing that where they will realize that gender is important, and the need to do that vulnerability test is where we need to get our governments and policymakers to arrive at, so that they can also push back when they are cutting down on these social services. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugenia, for those reflections. We couldn't agree more. Gender and women are not a by-the-way thing and not something that should be embedded in something else. Yes, it is important. Thank you so much. We have got a hand from Isabel.
Hi, do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, I'm Isabella from Brazil. I'm happy to see some of the women I've met in the negotiations of the tax convention in Nairobi here. And thank you so much for the presentations. It was really insightful. My thoughts were just based on my comrade here from Brazil that has really well spoken about our austerity programs. And I would just like to highlight the fact that here in Brazil, we right now, for a long time, we don't have an external debt. We have internal debt only. And even with this, we are also abiding by the rules of the IMF, because we have internalized those rules in our austerity programs. So I guess it's really important for us to connect our discussions about external debt and the impacts on women, also with combating austerity in general, and talking also about monetary sovereignty and dismantling those myths, those ideological myths of austerity, because we are in a world of fiduciary coins. All right, our coins do not have any attachments to something like gold or so on. So the countries, as we know, like United States, Japan, and so on, they have more than 200% of their GDP on debt, and this is never to be paid. It's not something to be paid because it has turned into bonds, and bonds are throughout all the economy and so on. And so I really think we should connect this issue also. And finally, just praising the last commentator, which has said about the taxing on bets and on cigarettes, alcohol, and so on, because yes, this is like a characteristic of tax. It is a necessity that we tax those things, but it is also a regressive taxation, right? And any taxation on consumption would be regressive. And here in Brazil, for example, because of the austerity programs and the fact that we don't have budgets, because we ourselves put those limits to the budget, we don't have budgets to the minimum for the people, and we are now fighting to put tax on the bets in order to finance the things that should be financed anyway, that should be the minimum for the population. So this is a trap in my view, because those things, yes, they need to be taxed, but for other reasons, not just for financing policies. Because if we don't have those taxes, then we won't have the funding for basic policies. You see what I mean? So that's a problem. And in case of bets, more specifically, here in Brazil, the way they are, they should be like totally prohibited and not even something that's going to be taxed. So thank you very much for my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for those meaningful reflections on regressive tax. Wouldn't agree more. Do we have any other reflections or submissions? If we don't have any, I'm now going to hand over to Ashina. Ashina is the Tax and Education Alliance Coordinator at ActionAid International. Ashina is passionate about human rights, feminist economies, and intersectional justice. Her work focuses on advocating for ambitious, progressive, gender-responsive domestic financing for education and other public services. This builds up on her previous work unpacking the impact of austerity on education and healthcare, especially for women and girls and people living in poverty, not only in Kenya, but globally. Ashina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chika. Thank you for sharing, for everyone who has shared already, and for facilitating that discussion. It has been really insightful and reassuring to hear the shared experiences across different contexts. I know that some hands were up to speak just before Chika handed over. I had seen Marta's hand, and there was one more hand that is now down. So maybe Marta, you can go ahead, share just in 1 minute, and then we can move on to the next part of the discussion, which is very connected, for us to brainstorm together what would radical resistance look like in light of all that we've discussed. So over to you, Marta, for just a brief intervention, and then we'll continue the discussion on radical resistance.
Okay, basically, I am not for radical resistance. I am really about radical transformation. And what I want to say here is that, these kind of reports are so meaningful, so important, so urgent, especially in these times when we see wars and wars and wars. And, a lot of times it seems to me that these three really are issues of peace. The United Nations is about peace. The United Nations is being destroyed. And so at some time we have to also look at what is it that is defining the situations that we live in, because it's not of our making. It's really that we are being exploited all the time. And so how do we create conditions at the same time that affect from the individual to the national to the global, but really talking about what we need to live in peace, not in pieces. That's all I need to say at this point. But I am urging that we really see it from an issue that is really telling us that we are not going anywhere with the IMF and the World Bank and all those things and all those taxations. Look at what Trump has just done to every country. Everybody's on their knees, and then more wars, and we cannot do anything about it. So how do we include this discussion in these discussions that we have? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Indeed, what we need to do so we don't live in pieces, but we live in peace. And indeed, we look towards radical transformation. I see Chika's hand. Chika Oko, you can also go ahead, and then we'll move on to the next part.
Thank you very much, Ashina, and thanks everyone for the intervention. My name is Chika Oko, and I work with International Budget Partnership in Nigeria. And I've been leading tax equity initiatives for IBP in Nigeria. A lot of our work in the past years have focused on gender and taxation, and a lot of intervention, a lot of input from the presenters have resonated. I think one thing that has been missing is the fact that, where we find instances of gender inequality within the tax system is actually within the informal sector, informal economy. We all know that more than 70% of women in Africa and developing economies, they are found within the informal sector. But then our experience has shown that tax strategies, taxation within the informal sector is not as well developed as in the formal sector. And that's where we find a lot of regressivity. Women's contributions are insignificant, not taken into consideration. We find a lot of irregularities, which end up impacting women more than it impacts any group. And I think that any conversation on gender and taxation that does not start with this, it's something we really need to pay attention to. Usually it is largely ignored, and this feels like a silent majority that's not given any attention at national level, regional, and at global level. And I think we shouldn't toe along the same line. I think we need to highlight and it's not fight back, but try to change the narratives through data, because this is what they respect. For instance, Nigeria is just emerging from a national tax reform. We are still in the middle of it. And we saw the constant pushback on gender and taxation. There is no recognition at that level that there is any connection between gender and taxation. And if it starts from that level, then it trickles down to the subnational, and the impact continues to go on. So this is to say that we need to pay very serious attention to issues of gender and taxation, especially within the informal sector. So I wanted to bring this up. And we cannot change the narrative unless we come up with numbers. We need to come up with the statistics. We really need to show what the impact is, so that we don't get these issues subsumed in other conversations, where it is considered irrelevant and not as important as generating domestic resource mobilization at all costs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chika. You've actually, your intervention has really helped to move us into the discussion of what we can do, what we need to do as part of our resistance, our radical resistance that will move us towards transformation, as we've been reminded. I see your hand, Willette, but I'll request that we just have an introduction into the next part of the discussion, and then your intervention can already be part of that ongoing conversation. So, sisters, friends, colleagues, I'll invite us now to a time of continuing the discussion to brainstorm together of what resistance and transformation will look like, radical transformation. Because as we know, the IMF and its sister institution, the World Bank, have now been in existence for over 80 years. Many of us have been working in this space for a long time and have been generating this evidence, highlighting and amplifying this evidence, the voices of the women, the girls, the communities that have been directly affected, and pushing back against it. And there has been some progress. But we've also seen really concerted efforts to frustrate that progress. And it's been done both through soft measures, right? So we've seen what in the climate space they'll call greenwashing, and in discussions on gender, it's pinkwashing, where the institutions co-opt our language and they try to sound progressive, like one of the speakers shared earlier. It sounds progressive on the face of it, but once you interrogate what it is in practice, what the impact that it's having, it's not actually making a difference. It's continuing to increase harm, to increase inequality. I've heard before from Bhumika Mushala explaining how the Civil Society Policy Forum was instituted, that before there'd be a lot of protests outside of the IMF and World Bank spring meetings, outside their annual meetings, and eventually the media attention would focus more on the civil society protests and the protests by movement and diminish the attention on the bank and the fund. And this is how, as a result, they instituted this space for dialogue with civil society, but really was also an effort to reduce the effect, reduce the impact, reduce the momentum and progress that movements were having in challenging the IMF directly. Lately, as again we've heard, it's become more aggressive, more apparent. There's less of an effort to hide it. So even that space within the Civil Society Policy Forum has been shrunk considerably. And like we've seen with war and conflict breaking out in many different places, of course, it's shrinking the space that's available to challenge governments, to challenge the IMF and the World Bank on some of these policies that are fueling the crisis rather than setting the right conditions for peace. So what can we do together? Perhaps continue doing or start doing or do differently to take us closer towards the transformation that we need. The floor is open. You can put up your hands and make an intervention, and you're also welcome to share something in the chat in terms of what you think we need to do. Willett, your hand was up before. I'm not sure if you would like to already start us off. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the presenters. The issue of tax, IMF austerity measures is affecting all countries and is something that we are happy to gather to talk about. So I just wanted to mention that the impact of the IMF-backed tax and austerity measure on women in Liberia has been a critical issue. And there are a lot of evidences that are showing these policies have, deep roots on affecting gender. So especially on areas around the strained public services currently that women and girls are faced with in Liberia, and which increase the burden on women and also the unpaid care work. Eugenia spoke about it. I think it's cross-cutting, it's a cross-border, and is highly impacting girls and women, especially in the rural area in Liberia. And this also has high impact on girls' education in Liberia. So looking at this, we're talking about discussion around focusing on radical and persistent or transformational approaches for what you're talking. I just wanted to flag or to mention what are some of the actions that we are involved with in Liberia that is helping to raise voices around this. So particularly in Liberia right now, our work is focusing on organizing and mobilizing young women, and at the urban level and also at the district level. So just recently, young women were able to come together to meet with the Women Legislative Caucus of Liberia to speak out on some of these issues that are affecting, their participation, that's also affecting their economic choices, even when it comes to education. So these are some things we're trying to do to strengthen the voices of these young women at the national and also at the county level to be able to speak around these issues. So yeah, we really, really hold this discussion to heart, and we probably the next meeting or so, we get some clear reflection and some other outcomes of some of these mass actions that young women, district women movements are involved with. So I just wanted to mention that as we are in the right conversation for it. So thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Willett. It's really important that we continue to be in solidarity with and amplify and strengthen the voices of young women in these spaces. Any other person want to come in? I think Phindu, your hand was up at some point. You're also welcome to to share your insights. All right, as I can
No, that's
go
okay, Ashtina. What I wanted to say had been mentioned earlier. I was just going to echo what has already been mentioned. So I'm good now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if anyone else would like to come in and share the ideas that you've had, this space is safe. There's nothing that's too complicated, too expensive, too long-term. We really do need to be thinking long-term organizing. Even the idea that's been a whisper in your heart, this is a space you can share. Over to you, Eugenia.
I just wanted to share that one thing I think Ghana is doing very well that maybe other sister countries can do is try and get a coalition of other CSOs, like-minded CSOs. We have an economic governance, economic justice working group. And I think we pushed so much so that the IMF calls us to table to discuss issues with us before they even go sign things with government. So but for the last ECF, there was a meeting like that where we sat and said we wouldn't want them to cut education or put some regulations on public spending in terms of social protection. I think that has worked very well because we have the numbers and we are working in a coalition. The IMF sort of sees us now as a formidable group where they cannot bypass and then go and talk to government. So I think that is something that other sister countries can do. So for now, every time IMF meets with government before they come out with their final paper, the economic justice team is actually also met separately to discuss their concerns. I think that is something that other countries can also push for. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Eugenia. We have a couple of minutes if there's anyone else who'd like to share an idea. Something that we can start to do or stop doing or do differently. So Eugenia has told us about working in coalition and having an inside track with government. Over to you, Jessica.
I think the only other thing for me, in the spirit of how CSPF was started and with some of the sentiments that have already been spoken around protesting, I feel like because of the progress that's been made previously, since the initial movement building happened around pushing for human rights and women's rights and justice and equality, I feel like maybe as civil society, we've gotten nice. We're very nice. Even in the way that we interact with IMF staff at these meetings, we're very kind and nice, which is great because our movement and our work is rooted in humanity. It's great, but we also know that the IMF doesn't really recognize humanity, nor do they treat us as such. And I don't know what that's going to look like, but I feel like we need to stop being nice because being nice and polite and respectful isn't getting us anywhere. And so maybe we need to think the niceness. That's my thought. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Jessica. I really resonate with it, having been in a meeting, sharing evidence about the human cost of public sector cuts, for instance, and the IMF officials being entirely unmoved and saying it's a necessary cost for the government to be able to access credit markets again. And for them, success is access to credit markets, no matter the cost, even if it means women and girls going without quality healthcare, even if it means women and girls not being able to access quality education. And that's just not an acceptable standard. I see in the chat, Isabella adds that we should stop making meetings in the US. Also completely agree. And Willett also adds that we need to continue strengthening voices of women and young women around the issues to speak boldly and demand tax justice. Also completely agree. For the speakers who shared earlier, Chika, Maryellen, do you have anything you'd like to add just before we hand over to the last part of the discussion? In 2 lines or less. Okay. If not, if anything comes to mind, feel free to continue adding your thoughts in the chat. And I'm now really happy to hand over back to Phindu, who has another piece to share with us. Over to you, Phindu.
Thank you so much, Ashina, and thank you everyone for your contributions during this session. I think we've been able to carefully ground where we stand and to locate the urgent need for us to prioritize care, as we've been talking about. The piece that I will share now is entitled After the Storm, and it is based on regeneration and resilience as we navigate compounding crises. Do you ever notice how after a storm, the world smells new? Like the earth has just begun again. That is how we keep surviving through the flood, through the fire, through the noise, and still find ways to grow. They say the storm will pass, but we know better. We have been through too many to wait for calm seas. We do not just survive storms, we dance in them. We plant seeds in the rain and turn to the dirt, never in vain. We have faced it all. Crises layered like clouds, climate, conflict, cost of living, and yet here we are, glorious, still singing, still showing up. Our strength does not come from pretending things are fine. It comes from knowing they are not and choosing joy anyway. It comes from braiding hope into our hair and passing laughter across generations. Regeneration is not just a fancy word, it is what we do every single day. We take what is broken and make it bloom. We turn leftover fabric into something beautiful. We turn pain into poetry, loss into language, and worry into wisdom. We have learned to grow gardens from ashes. We have learned that tears make good water. We have learned that we bend, yes, but we do not break. Every time a sister says, I am still here, another root grows deeper. Every time we choose to sing and dance after disaster, another tree rises tall. The world may crack, but through those cracks, light finds a way in, and we find each other. So let the storms come. We have built boats from laughter. We have built shelters from rest. We have built homes from our own hands. And when the next one hits, we will be ready. Not because we are unshaken, but because we have learned and mastered the sacred art of beginning again in sisterhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Phindu, for that powerful and hopeful close, and for reminding us to remain joyful and hopeful despite the storm that is the current state of the world right now. So thank you so much for ending this session on that very powerful close. I would have loved to leave it as is, but I also just want to thank everyone for sharing this space with us as we work to push for tax justice for women's rights and for all the amazing and radical ideas that we've shared. Really, really grateful for everybody that was able to join this conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, that this is part of the Global Days of Action for Tax Justice for Women's Rights, which is an ongoing campaign. So this is just one activity as part of the global campaign that started yesterday, and it's going to end on the 8th of March, which is on Sunday, which is also Women's Day. So if you can engage in other campaign activities, please do so. There's webinars happening every day. You can also participate through digital campaigns where you take a photo of yourself with one of the campaign demands and share on your social media platforms, and also just encourage more people within your community, within your constituency to talk about tax justice for women's rights. So we need more people talking about this. So if you can, please do so. And I would also love to invite you to our second webinar that is happening on Thursday, the 5th of March, where we'll be now talking about tax justice in relation to the cost of education. That's also going to take place on Zoom. We're going to share a link shortly in the chat. So if you can, please do join that conversation as well. And yeah, once again, thanks everyone, and I hope to see you on Thursday. This session was also recorded, and we'll be able to share that with you once we have the recording of this. Thanks everyone, and thanks to all the amazing speakers as well for all your brilliant interventions. Thank you.
Thank you.